Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi, this episode is about decision-making, at work and about work, as the nature of work evolves and our attitudes and arrangements change too. Making good decisions at work isn't self-evident. We bring baggage and learn behaviors from previous work environments, situations, and relationships. We are affected by corporate culture, how much information is typically shared, questions asked, and alternatives debated. Team dynamics play a role. How much responsibility does your boss give you? Do you have a trusting relationship? And our formative years also impact how we act, communicate, collaborate, and decide. All these elements can influence our decisions subconsciously as undetected biases, which are best identified and avoided, so as not to make assumptions and decisions based on incomplete information or unchallenged previous circumstances. For example, should everyone work at the office all week because that's what I've done for decades? Making decisions isn't easy when so much is in flux. It is useful to pass decisions based on how much data you have and need to make a definitive conclusion and choice, with what impact and for how long. Timely and sound decisions about work protocols and practices, such as whether employees can optimize for individual and team performance, are critical for your results. So I'm delighted to be speaking with Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, CEO of the boutique consulting, coaching, and training firm Disaster Avoidance Experts. Gleb is an international speaker and best-selling author of 7 books, including Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, from 2019, and more recently, Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, a manual on benchmarking to best practices for competitive advantage, which is from 2021. Hi, Gleb. How are you?
Hi, Sophie. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very intrigued by your books, a lot of articles that you've written, particularly the ones in the Hill. First of all, I start at the beginning, and you've done a BA, MA, and a PhD. What did you study first? What was your BA NYU about?
That was in history. I was always interested in how people behaved. And so I decided to study people in their historical contexts because you have the most information available about history rather than what's going on right now. As people say, newspaper is the first draft of history, and that's what we have available. But when you go back and you look at the older archive, you have way more information available to what's actually going on, whether it's a corporate archive, whether it's a government archive. That's besides newspapers, which are always available for that time period. And then, of course, people are much more willing to talk about what happened 30, 40 years ago than they are willing to talk about what happened now. Because the stuff doesn't matter nearly as much, and people aren't nearly as worried about what others will think. That's why I started researching in my BA history and what happened in historical perspectives. And that's kind of how I continued. I was researching for my master's. I continued doing research, narrowing down. And then for my PhD, I was looking at behavioral science, decision-making in historical and contemporary perspectives.
Going back to the history and how that evolves into behavioral science, one of the things that I find fascinating about history is that historical truth is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak, or in the perspectives of the different parties involved. I studied Chinese at university, and one of the things that was incredibly interesting to me was the Opium Wars. And of course, the Chinese perspective, the British perspective, completely different. Was it something like that that brought your interest from studying history and the different perspectives that people have to studying people and their behaviors?
It wasn't so much differences in perspectives, it's differences in incentives. and motivations. So I was always interested in what actually motivates people. Because what is history or politics, whatever you look at it, people's behaviors, right? In historical perspectives, you can get the newspaper is going to be the first draft of history. Then you go into the archives and you see what people were really saying behind the scenes. Then you actually talk to them, you have verbal conversations, you interview them, and you see how they describe their own motivations. But people often don't even know what their own motivations are. They don't know how they interact, and they don't understand why they make the decisions that they do. We're not very good at making decisions. We often just follow our intuitions, we go with our gut. I wrote a book about that.
Right.
And so that is what really fascinated me when I started looking at why do people make decisions in the way that they do? What motivates them? What incentivizes them? So that's really what fascinates me. Just before our conversation, for example, this podcast recording, I was on a conversation. I was doing coaching for a leader of a company, and it was supposed to be a 1-hour call. It turned out to be a 2-hour and 15 minutes call. So fortunately, I was paid by the hour, which is good. And, it was really an in-depth call where we went over how his decision-making is motivated in part by things that happened 20 years ago, the way that he was brought up, his family, that his parents divorced when he was young, and now he's worried about making conflictual statements to other senior managers because he has a background of his family that they split, and he's worried that if he creates conflicts, then that will create splits in the senior management team. And so he has that. And that's an issue for him, of course, because sometimes you need healthy conflicts and you need to express disagreements. And he gets walked over a little bit too much by the other senior managers because of that. And so that was just one thread out of our conversation, but it takes a lot of time for people to make that reflection. And he's like, oh, wow. He's like, that's a very deep sort of conversation, right?
Sure.
So that's something I'm really passionate about going deep into what actually motivates people, what causes people to behave in the way that they behave, what are their incentives. You can see incentives from the outside, but you can't see what's going on internally. And so those motivations and incentives were really what fascinated me. How do we make decisions individually? How do we make decisions in group settings? And so from that history is how I then started incorporating tools from behavioral science, because what enabled me to handle that conversation, that 2-hour, 15-minute conversation, is the behavioral science background that I was able to understand, okay, these are the kinds of motivations that will cause him to behave in this way. And how do I respond to him in such a way as to point out that, hey, there was research showing that in order to have healthy conflicts with people, you should follow a 5-to-1 ratio, where you do for each one conflictual thing, you do at least 5 equivalently positive things, and that will keep your relationship healthy with people. It's actually not good to just always have positive interactions. So looking at the research, I can bring that in, and that can inform my conversations and help people make good decisions.
When you were starting your teaching fellowship in North Carolina, you were focused then not just on decision making, but also cognitive bias, risk management, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, and future proofing. Future proofing is pre-decision making, like the thought you put into what you're going to do in the future. That also, in some ways, is an indication of the path that you have taken over the course of those 20 years. How did you think about it then? What were some of the highlights and threads in terms of what you were studying, what you were teaching, and what you were learning from university students who are at the very beginning? They have more malleable brains, I guess. Those cognitive biases, so many of those do come from our childhood experiences.
So in terms of future-proofing, that for me, of course, is looking at how do you make sure that you have good decision-making in the future? How do you prevent problems in the future? So proofing yourself against future shock, proofing yourself against future disruptions. And that's a very complex conversation. So just using the case study I just mentioned just now, just because it's very fresh in my mind, what I was talking to this person about, this leader, is the conversation that, hey, if you don't have conflicts, if you avoid conflicts, he's conflict avoidant. He's great in many ways, but he's conflict avoidant. If you don't have that, then you're going to be making serious errors in the future. You're not going to set yourself up for success in the future, because you will be avoiding these conflicts and you won't have healthy relationships going forward. So that's just a fundamental principle, that you will not be making good decisions if you don't protect yourself by setting up good relationships and having good decision-making practices in the future. So I think that's the kind of things that I taught students earlier onward, thinking about the future and thinking about decision hygiene, decision making. So all the social intelligence, emotional intelligence, cognitive biases. If you can identify those in yourself right now, you can really set yourself up for a lot of success down the road. So this person, the leader I was talking to him about concepts like the omission bias. The omission bias is the cognitive bias where we treat the consequences of inaction as less problematic than the consequences of action. Mm-hmm. But of course, when we think about it logically, not taking an action can be worse in many ways than taking an action. It can have very negative consequences when you avoid having a conflict, and then you let things fester, and then you have much bigger problems down the road. Or you avoid making an investment, you avoid taking a risk, and that causes a lot of problems down the road. So thinking in those terms, he was like, oh, if I recognize this omission bias early onward, I'll be much further along in my career, in my journey, than I am right now. And so that's what I try to convey to students. That's what I try to convey to students, the importance of recognizing within yourself these poor decision-making habits, because we all have them. We all have cognitive biases. We all have various ways that our minds are miswired and cause us to make bad decisions. So setting yourself up for long-term success means identifying right now at this stage, as much as possible, these cognitive biases within yourself and helping yourself make good decisions down the road. So that's what I was teaching.
From there, then you were doing the same as a professor at Ohio State, and then you started writing books. Mm-hmm. And the first one was about truth. Truth is not easy to capture, and facts themselves are open to interpretation. There are very few objective facts. Mm-hmm. What was the genesis of your book about truth seekers? What was the connection between what you were teaching and your first book?
So throughout the time I was in graduate school and then going into teaching as a professor, so as a lecturer at Ohio State, a lecturer at UNC Chapel Hill, as the Ohio State. Mm-hmm. I was also doing consulting for companies at the same time. Okay. And that more real-world experience, as well as my work with students, helped inform my book. So the Truth Seeker's Handbook, a Science-Based Guide. That book was focused on how do you figure out the facts? How do you figure out the truth, even though it's uncomfortable to do so?
That came straight out of a lot of corporate experience, huh?
Yes. Yeah, I mean...
What truths were not being seen in those corporate environments?
Well, to continue with what's fresh in my mind, with this person, he was not seeing the fact that others were walking all over him too much. Mm-hmm. That was one problem. Right. Another problem that he wasn't seeing is delegation. So I'll give you an example. He thought of himself as a great delegator. So sales manager, delegates a lot of stuff. But when we got into delegation more deeply, we realized that he acknowledged he's holding on to one large corporate account that's taking up 50% of his time. And we talked about why is he doing that. And it turned out that it's because the founder of the company, who's the current boss of the company, that was the founder's account, which the founder passed on to him. And he really didn't want to let go and delegate that account because he was worried that somebody would be making a mistake, and he was feeling good that he has that account that the founder used to have. But when we talked about it, he's like, oh, if I delegate that account, the sales department can grow much quicker because his time can be used much more effectively. And so he had this huge blind spot. He thought of himself as a good delegator, but he was still holding on to this account. So within our heads, we can fit the information that, yes, we are a good delegator while not delegating something that we should have delegated and it's taking up 50% of our time, right? So that seems very contradictory, but that's the way we are. We are human beings. We are full of contradictions. Walt Whitman says, I contradict myself. I'm full of multitudes, right? And so that is one truth that was not visible to him, as one example.
Now I'm seeing the thread in terms of the second book being never go with your gut.
Yes.
Which therefore speaks to those truths that you're not seeing. I guess you're saying you need to be much more thoughtful and develop more clarity about the reality of what you're dealing with rather than making assumptions.
Yeah.
So you had truth seekers and then never go with your gut. And then the third one was blind spots. There's a very strong thread there. You're looking how you deliver the message in different ways. And that I find is very interesting because of my work in empathy. How you deliver the message and the way you come at it obviously determines how it lands and how people hear it. Those three books, I imagine, cover some of the same ground, but coming at it from different ways. Who are the different people that you have found these different approaches work with in different ways?
So yes, the Truth Seeker's Handbook is about seeing the truth, seeing the facts. Okay. Never Go With Your Gut is about making good decisions in corporate business settings of all sorts. And the blind spots between us is about relationships of all sorts, personal, professional. Right. So those are distinct topics within decision-making. Right. And my focus has always been on helping people make good decisions, but of course in different areas of their life. So seeing the truth is very important to make a good decision, but that's not the same thing as making a good decision.
Sure.
And making a good decision in business is different than making a good decision in relationships, also it's overlapping. I'll give you an example from Never Go With Your Gut in terms of making decisions, a strategy. So these are 5 key questions that you want to ask yourself before making any decision that you don't want to screw up. So if you don't want to regret a decision, here are 5 key questions to ask.
Got it.
So first question is, what important information haven't I yet fully considered? So what evidence haven't you taken into account? And here's the thing. So this is business decision making. The large majority of business decision making comes through making a business case for something. So that means finding information to prove a point, making a business case for profitability and so on. However, that's not really good for making a decision. That's good for persuading someone that your decision is correct. But if you want to actually make a good decision, what you want to do is try to prove yourself wrong. Try to prove that your decision is incorrect. Try to disconfirm your decision. So that's a much more effective approach.
Which not that many people use.
Correct. And that's why it's in the book, because a lot of this is the counterintuitive, right? Our gut intuition is to find information to support our beliefs. And that's good, again, for convincing other people and ourselves to make whatever decision we're predisposed to anyway. But if that initial decision is wrong, that's very bad. That is not a good thing at all.
That is the scientific approach, which is you can only prove something by being able to disprove it, which doesn't actually prove it. It means it's just a way to disprove it.
Right. And there's a reason that our civilization has only started to move forward in its technology since the scientific revolution of the 1600s, right? That's what led to the Industrial Revolution. The use of science, the use of the scientific method. And so and this is the same idea that you use a scientific method, try to disconfirm your initial beliefs in order to make a good decision. So that's one step. The other step 2, or question 2, is what dangerous judgment errors haven't I yet fully considered? So these cognitive biases, we talked about omission bias. We mentioned empathy. So when you're thinking about other people, one issue is the empathy gap. We might underestimate the emotions that other people are experiencing. We might underestimate our own emotions. one of the biggest challenges and problems in business decision-making is failure to think sufficiently about emotions, our own emotions and other people's emotions.
Sure.
We don't realize how important emotions are. And so we don't think about them nearly enough.
Or necessarily want to deal with them or feel comfortable dealing with them.
Mm-hmm.
There are many elements to that as well, which changed during the pandemic or we had to get more comfortable with. It's the emotional side of things. That greater depth of interaction is something that we're needing to learn to be much more effective, right?
Absolutely. So we need to be introspective about our emotions. Going back to this leader, he was not sufficiently introspective about his emotions and what his emotions were causing him to do, and what the consequences was of his emotions and his reluctance to have conflicts with people. And so that causes us to not be as good leaders and decision makers at all levels, not simply at the leadership level. And so that's a big problem.
I would direct listeners to go and look for the other 3 points in that book, because there's so much else that I want to get to.
Sure.
Thank you very much for going through those points. There's obviously enormous amount of valuable content in your books. Thinking about your background and what you understand about human beings, maybe in consulting and coaching, and you set up a new company about disaster mitigation.
Yes.
Why did you start that company? And then what happened as the pandemic took its course?
Yes, in 2018. So I started my academic career at UNC Chapel Hill in 2004. And I was, again, then at Ohio State as a professor. So I was at UNC Chapel Hill for 8 years. I was a professor at Ohio State for 7 years. And my outside consulting got a bit too big. And universities don't like it when you do a lot of outside consulting. And so in 2018, I left academia to pursue consulting full-time.
Got it.
And I started a company called Disaster Avoidance Experts. The reason for the name of the company, Disaster Avoidance, is because I wanted people to avoid disaster. So there's a famous line by Ben Franklin that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's what I wanted people to really be thinking about. How do we avoid disaster? Not recovering from disaster, not, managing disaster, but avoiding it. And good decision-making is essential to avoiding disaster. I'm not trying to attract CEOs who just want to optimize a little bit.
Okay.
That is not my goal. My goal is to really speak to people who recognize that if they don't make good decisions, and if their people don't make good decisions, that can land them in a disastrous situation. And it happens at the leadership level all the time, that there are conflicts, there are tensions at the company level that lead to disastrous decision-making, that you waste a lot of money, you waste a lot of time, cause a lot of pain for people. That's unnecessary. And that's what I'm really passionate about.
If we can go to the pandemic, true disasters that people were trying to avoid, disasters that were not of their making, and trying to navigate without having necessarily either facts or historical reference to be able to make good decisions, thinking about people's behavior and the situation that they're dealing with at that point.
Absolutely. Now, already in January 2020, I was talking to my clients that this will be quite a bit more impactful and disturbing than you might think. I mean, there were so many people who in late March were still thinking that it would be only 2-week disturbance, 3-week disturbance.
Right.
And I was saying that this will be many, many months, likely years. You need to be really prepared. And so having that long-term perspective and that appropriate modeling, not falling into this kind of hyperbolic discounting the future, and having that wishful thinking bias of hoping that your desire for it to be 2 weeks long will result in it being 2 weeks long.
Right.
Like looking at what happened in Wuhan in November 2019, how a major city, pretty sizable city in a very quite developed country, the size of Chicago, was shut down for many months.
Right.
That does not spell 2-week disruption.
How were you able to help and guide leaders at that time trying to navigate such a complex and challenging situation?
So the technical names for that form of wishful thinking were the belief bias and the confirmation bias. So belief bias is when we let our beliefs influence our judgments, our decision making. And then confirmation bias is when we look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. And these are definitely big, big problems that we're seeing all the time, but especially at that time, those were very serious issues. So what I did was to help leaders look beyond essentially their noses, so what was happening immediately in the moment, and look at other countries and what was happening in other countries, because in other countries, the pandemic was more advanced than it was in the US in June and July. And I was saying, okay, other countries are equally developed countries that have solid situations with their healthcare systems. Let's look at what's happening there, and let's model of what will happen here based on what's happening there.
Right.
And that really helped open up people's eyes, because what they were used to was what happened earlier with the H1N1 pandemic that was much more minor. It was impactful, if you remember that in the Obama years. It had an impact, but it was relatively short-lived. It was maybe something like 10,000 something people died, which is obviously terrible, but it's not nearly to the millions and millions of people who died of COVID. And so I helped them realize that this is not comparable. Look at what's happening in other countries. The same thing will happen here. And we need to use the lesson of other countries to model what's happening in the US. Unfortunately, too many people in the US have this idea of US exceptionalism and not comparing the US to what's happening elsewhere. And so that's where it's a big problem, that you're not that there's that sense of exceptionalism, even sometimes in the regions in the US. For example, when we saw what was happening, if you remember back to April 2020, what was happening in New York City. The mortuaries, the morgues, there was that hospital ship dispatched to New York. It was pretty terrible. Yeah, it was pretty terrible. And there were so many people. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I have obviously a higher client base in Columbus, Ohio than elsewhere. So I had to really talk to people and tell them that, look, if this is what's happening in New York City, it's not because of New York City's sins. Sin City. That's not why that's what it's happening. It is a natural consequence of this pandemic and the course that it's taking. It will happen here. It will happen where you are. So even that regional bias predilection happens. And that's what also I help leaders realize, that you need to look at those comparisons and reframe your thinking about what will happen here.
And people's belief bias about New Yorkers' sins. But anyway.
Yes, exactly.
So fast forward a bit. Return to the office has been happening, let's just say 22, 23. There isn't yet sufficient data on a consistent basis to be able to be convincing. We do have that now, but we didn't during that time. Your penultimate book is about hybrid and remote working as a competitive advantage, which is very much where my head is, enabling people to have flexibility to be working in the type of ways that they want. So much of the challenges in the conversation is how resistant people are to changing their behaviors. And when there isn't enough convincing data to be able to overcome their belief bias, and there is some apparent evidence they can find to support their confirmation bias, how did you approach it then?
Yeah, so I published that book, Returning to the Office and Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, the first version of it, second version came out. But the first version I published in May 2021. And that was based on that was based on 12 case studies with companies that were, after the initial vaccinations, were increasingly available, and they were also some employees who started returning to the office already in the end of 2020, and then starting in that period. And so what I saw I was looking very carefully at the evidence in terms of remote work, that what my clients overwhelmingly saw is that people were more productive working from home, and they were able to achieve their goals working from home, achieve their KPIs working from home. And that was surprising for them. And I was like, oh, that's great that they are able to do that. And then there was a change that number of leaders wanted their employees to return to the office. And I was like, okay, so why exactly do you want them to return to the office? Like, what's the motivation? What benefits do you gain? And so then you want to look at the benefits that you gain from people returning to the office, because obviously employees were equally productive, more productive for the large part working remotely. So what benefits are you actually gaining by asking people to come to the office? People will be commuting. They don't like that, very reluctant to do so. We very clearly saw evidence. And so very clearly, you need to have good motivations to get people to come to the office. And the best reason to come to the office is to collaborate. So have collaboration, those in-person conversations for collaboration and socializing, bonding. So those are some good reasons to come to the office. But how often do you actually need to come to the office for collaboration? Like, how much time do you spend collaborating versus working on your individual tasks, responding to emails, and so on? And so I was helping guide my clients to think about this in the way, okay, you want to come to the office for collaboration. The challenge for a number of my clients is that their managers really wanted people to be in the office because that's how they were comfortable managing people. So they, during that period of time, even though their employees were more productive for the most part working remotely, managers weren't comfortable. They didn't feel like they could be confident that they were really controlling their people effectively, managing their people effectively while they were working remotely.
The managers were correct in that. It was harder. I'm curious as to how you managed to assuage their fears, I guess.
Well, the main thing is offering training and offering techniques. So for having a combination of training and techniques to help managers to not simply manage by walking around. Because honestly, when you look at the best practices, having clear outcome-oriented practices rather than managing by walking around and seeing who's working was already a best practice long before the pandemic. And having that, we know there's extensive research showing that results in much better outcomes for employee engagement, employee productivity, morale, relationship with managers. So it's a matter of looking at what was the best practice anyway, and that fits very well whether you're working remotely, whether you're working in the office, or whether you're working in a hybrid modality. So I was taking that information about these outcome-based approaches, that using KPIs, key performance indicators, OKRs, objectives and key results, which typically are determined on a team basis, and applying them to the individual people within a team. And having, instead of that once big annual performance evaluation, which is fine for managing by walking around, to having frequent small-scale performance evaluations. So, for example, one very effective technique that I do in my trainings and consulting all the time is having weekly performance evaluations, small-scale performance evaluations, where the manager and their direct report choose 3 to 5 goals for the week that are tied to the team's broader KPIs. And then the direct report works on them and then sends a report to the supervisor a day before their next one-on-one, talking about what they accomplished, any problems that they met, and a self-evaluation on how they solved those problems. And then at the one-on-one, they discuss that. The manager coaches them on problem solving, affirms or revises their evaluation, and then together they set 3 to 5 goals for the next week. And that's a very simple, easy technique, right? It took me a minute to explain. And it's kind of obvious. Managers like, oh yes, this is not that hard. I do one-on-ones anyway. The good managers do one-on-ones once a week anyway. So like, oh, we'll just introduce a performance management component to it. That's not too hard to do, right? But you have to think about that, and you have to accept that that's something that you want to do, and that you will use that to make sure that that people actually do the work that you want them to do, and that you're coordinated effectively around that.
Yes, and the way you say it sounds easy, but of course we do know that it's not,
Of course, it's not
including
easy.
this transition of leaders from command and control type instructors to coaches with the
Yeah.
weekly check-in. So giving those questions and setting those goals on a weekly basis gives a framework for that coaching. And it's a different mindset for the leader. There is much more focus and emphasis on trust. How were you helping earlier on? As I said, there's a lot of hesitation and people holding their breath to see what was going to happen. And this transition to a very different type of leadership, which is very much where we need to be and how we need to be leading as we move forward.
So coaching as leadership has been an idea that was gaining ground long before the pandemic. Having servant leaders, having coach leaders, and that's something that increasingly, rather than the command and control leaders, that was increasingly gaining predominance in the discourse. And of course, some managers had to be dragged a little bit screaming and kicking into it, but that was happening before the pandemic. So this is just an intensification of previous trends where it's like, okay, we're serious now.
And so, absolutely.
Yeah. So previously it was more like you could still get away with it, even though CEOs and CHROs would widely say, yes, we want coaching leaders, but now you really have to do it. So it's a matter of really having the middle managers take it seriously and having the CEOs and CHROs implement it seriously, partially because the pandemic, the having to spend a year working remotely didn't leave them with much of a choice. You don't have nearly as much control over your workers, and you have to trust them when they're working remotely by force. Like we were forced to work remotely, so you have to trust them. And especially when you're seeing that the outcomes are much better than you expected, well, okay, that proves the point, right? And so it's more a matter of how do you manage and navigate within this environment rather than grit your teeth and try to hold on and hope that you'll get back to the office in a week or two or a month. You have to realize, and this is what I was telling my clients, that this will be many months. This will be definitely something that you want to change your systems and processes. And we spent some time changing systems and processes earlier onward in the pandemic, and my clients were much better off because they averted the disaster of not changing their systems and processes in preparation and culture in preparation for the pandemic being quite a bit longer than a couple of weeks.
I was watching and, I mean, really observing very closely as I was writing my book starting in March 2021. Soon after that, we had the Great Resignation, and this sort of leads into today. There were lots and lots of people who were making different choices, having forced time to reflect and understanding, particularly in this country, but also in other countries around the world, that they could live their lives differently, that remote and hybrid options allowed them to configure their working lives in different ways that could fit better across all of their desired life activities. How did you interpret that based on the conversations you're having with companies, talking to employees, and just in terms of your observations at the time?
What was fascinating to me is that people really did change their preferences and habits during the pandemic. And I think that's something that a lot of leaders didn't really think would happen. They thought that, well, we can go back to what was the case before the pandemic. We can have everyone back in the office because that's what they're comfortable with. And they chose not to adopt these new strategies, which would be much better for the new world. And what we see, what the research very clearly shows, is that people's mindsets have changed. So, for example, there was a study coming out of the St. Louis Federal Reserve, which showed that people are working at approximately the same rate, actually a little bit higher labor force participation, but they're working fewer hours, voluntarily so, especially educated males, college-educated males are working fewer hours because they are coming to value their well-being and leisure time more than they did before. They changed their perspectives during the pandemic to value money less and value leisure and well-being more.
This is across
balance.
all ages?
Yes. This is working age males.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it would probably be something like, I'm guessing, 18 to 49, or it might have been 18 to 65. So one of those.
Interesting.
So that is showing that the surveys where we're seeing the same sort of information, where people are saying, yes, I'm willing to take 10% pay cut for more flexibility for remote work, that those are serious and people are actually doing, they're voting with their feet and they're willing to actually work less for the sake of higher flexibility and work-life balance. And that really shows the Great Resignation was another example of that, where people were leaving companies for the benefit of more flexibility. And so we're seeing that that's exactly what's happening. Companies that are having harsh return to office mandates are seeing much higher rates of resignations, much worse retention than they anticipated, according to a number of surveys. And so we're seeing that take place. And that is the information I try to convey to leaders and try to help them understand that the consequences of harsh return to office mandates and just in general, not paying attention to people, to how people change, not being empathetic to them. We're talking about empathy, not being empathetic to them, not understanding that their emotions matter. The emotions of your employees matter, how they feel matter. And they're actually taking steps based on their feelings around their retention, engagement, productivity, morale. And so if you don't consider that, you will have bad outcomes for your productivity, morale, retention, and recruitment.
Stepping back from the people side of it, although that obviously is part of it, with all the work that you've done working with companies about where they're working, how they're needing to work, how they best work, without preempting your answer, I'm curious as to how you think work, quote, needs to be set up in order to be effective in the work environment. And I'm not saying that any of this was created by the pandemic at all. I do not believe that. It was accelerated by it. For listeners to understand, coming at it from the pain points that different companies are having, the issues that they're challenged by with their employees and executives, because all of these come into play. How do you think companies need to be thinking about the workplace and how we're working and what are the key principles? I actually don't talk about best practice, but the key principles that people can be best thinking about to lead organizations into the future.
I think prior to the pandemic, we were really focusing and set up way too much with the industrial age mentality of the workplace as a factory. The factory is people sitting in the office and producing knowledge widgets, essentially.
Right. Okay.
And that is not the reality of the knowledge economy. That is not how people function best. So not sitting in an office and just be having the production floor. That is not how people function best. So for knowledge workers, which is really what the US, so we're not talking about on the plant manufacturing floor, but where the vast majority of value that the US brings to the economy is through knowledge work. And then knowledge work, it is the creation of the individual human mind and the collaborative human mind that determines the success of any company, that determines the value that's added. Right. And so when you look at the research and when you look at the best practices, principles of how people function best as knowledge workers to create ideas in their mind, the way that they function best is a combination of providing them with trust, trusting them to work in the way that they know how, providing them with autonomy, so being autonomous, having control over their time and location of work, providing them with necessary and appropriate support, so supporting their work, so giving them knowledge, information, tools, and facilitating their collaboration with others. So those, and collaboration in terms of asynchronous collaboration, synchronous, so all of those forms of collaboration. So those are the four fundamental principles that I would use and I encourage my clients to use in terms of knowledge work. Trust, autonomy, support, and collaboration. So those four principles determine how you set up the workplace of the future. It's not about remote work. It's not about in-office work.
Agreed.
It's about using those very clear behavioral science-based principles of how you will get the biggest value produced per dollar, per resource of time investment, of labor invested. That's what you really need to use to set up the workplace of the future. And so having that centrally inform the systems and processes of any company is what I think will result in the best outcomes.
So I have 3 questions left for you. It seems that one of the things that has been revealed, the tension in the return to office, has been the question of trust. And we've seen lots of monitoring and all the rest of it. How can companies improve the trust in their organizations? Because that is such a core component that hinders making progress for all those things that you're talking about, for all those changes that will make the workplace effective.
So one component of it is to set up appropriate systems and processes. I talked about performance evaluation. So one of the problems with traditional performance evaluation, the once annual performance evaluation, is that there is only once annual performance evaluation. Previously, managers can know whether their workers are working by walking around.
Right.
And that was integrating essentially trust into the work by observing whether your workers were working. Of course, it's not perfect. They could have been, checking their Facebook or whatnot while they're working. But it's a way that managers can at least feel that they have some control. So that needs to be replaced by a system of regular performance evaluation. The one I talked about is one way of doing so.
Sure.
A terrible way of doing so is keystroke monitoring or other form of observation, because people feel they lack that autonomy. They feel surveilled, they feel controlled. And so you're really undermining the mental performance, which is what you care about. Do you really care that they're typing, a 1,000-word email if what they should be typing is a 100-word email? And a 1,000-word email is not something that your customer will read thoroughly and will miss important things, whereas a 100-word email is going to be much more effective, right? So obviously that keystroke monitoring is very, very problematic. So not a good idea. So the setting up systems and processes for trust is one element. The other critical element of the trust equation is that you don't let one bad apple spoil the barrel.
Okay.
And here's the thing. Some individuals are not going to do well when they're working remotely. I said that the large majority of people were performing higher when they worked remotely. But there is a fraction of people who have a lot of trouble working remotely, who are very distracted. They just aren't able to do so, unable to focus. And probably for them, it's not a good idea to work remotely. They should be working in an office. And the crucial thing is that when an employer finds that someone is working poorly, whether it's they're working poorly, they're underperforming, or maybe it's like the very rare case that someone has more than one job, they have a side hustle, and their company agreement doesn't allow having a side job. In either of those cases, or some other circumstance where they're not working well remotely, you don't let that spoil the situation for everyone else who is an excellent performer when they're working remotely. So it's two sides of a coin. You set up systems and processes where you regularly have that accountability, and you don't let the small percentage of people who spoil the battle for everyone else actually spoil the battle.
Super. Thank you. And second question, another T, truth. Your first book was about truth. The most recent book is about AI and ChatGPT. I'm challenged to work out how we are going to understand where the sources of truth are that we need to rely on personally, but also professionally. If people are using AI tools to great effect, the absolute truth of facts and who or what institution, where they're being gathered from, is something that I see as a problematic situation ahead. And I wonder, with all the understanding that you have, both of technology and how we respond to technology and how we utilize it, what's that going to mean for us?
Yeah, it's interesting. So after I wrote that book on ChatGPT and using it, I realized that the future is going to depend much more on content curation than content creation. There's so much language and so many people are encouraged to be content creators. The thing is, generative AI is going to create a great deal of content. So content creation in the future is going to be less valuable. And content curation is going to be more valuable. That goes to what is truth, what is the source of truth. So what is the source of truth is that people will increasingly navigate and find content curators rather than creators who they trust. And those content curators can also be content creators, but it's going to be the curation part that is going to be especially valuable, because you think we have a whole fire hose of information right now. You ain't seen nothing yet with generative AI getting better and better. Each of us will need to find good content curators and figure out people and institutions who we trust to curate content for us.
And my last question, Gleb, which I always ask at the end, for companies who have accepted a hybrid model, they understand that they shouldn't have everybody back in the office and they've agreed to a hybrid model. What do you advise leaders at every level of the organization? What can they do next week that can help them adapt to what I call modern work, the new business environment and the work environment, to help them, bringing all your behavioral scientific understanding and great experience in this area?
The first thing that I would recommend to them to do next week is to actually survey their people. Because overwhelmingly, when we look at the information of how, when I come into a company and I ask, okay, give me your survey on hybrid work and employee engagement, they don't do that. They have not asked their people how they feel about hybrid work. They haven't asked their people about what the best practices are. They haven't asked what the problems are, what the opportunities for improvement are. So the first thing that they should do is actually talk to their people and figure out what their people need to achieve those outcomes. So that's what they really should be doing. They should be talking to their people about the four things I mentioned before. How can their people feel trusted? How can their people having appropriate accountability? How can their people have the autonomy? How can their people be well supported in that hybrid setting? And how can they collaborate effectively? So using those four tools, using those four categories, have those conversations, have anonymous surveys, have focus groups, and use those to inform your conversations and your policies going forward.
Gleb, you've covered so much and you've shared so many very useful insights and great stories, particularly from the last guy who you were talking with. So really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much for sharing your insights today.
Thank you so much for inviting me on the show, Sophie. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again so much to Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. You can follow Gleb on LinkedIn, on X at Gleb_Tsipursky, GLEB_TSIPURSKY, on Instagram at Dr_Gleb_Tsipursky, and on Facebook at Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. Immediate action tip. To adapt to modern work, survey employees about how they feel about hybrid work, best practices, problems, and opportunities for improvement. Focus conversations on trust, autonomy, support, and collaboration. For more about what information is important to make clear decisions about modern work environments and human-centric work policies, you can also read my book, Empathy Works, the key to competitive advantage in the new era of work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated, useful articles, commentary, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.